Hello, and welcome to day 2 of this 4-day symposium, Reimagining Post-COVID Education in the ASEAN region. My name is Graham Parr. I'm the Associate Dean International in the Faculty of Education here at Monash, and I'll be your host for the session today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the lands on which I speak to you today and by recognising that sovereignty was never ceded. I would like to specifically acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people, communities of the Kulin Nation, who are the ongoing custodians of the land on which Monash University now stands. We pay our respects through our research, teaching and learning to the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung elders and their past, present and future communities. It's my great pleasure to welcome back streamers who were here with us yesterday for the terrific first session of this symposium. And I want to welcome and extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us here for the first time today. I'm delighted to report that we have registrations from across the globe, including a substantial representation from ASEAN countries. I know that we've got plenty of people streaming in from Indonesia and Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, and some from further afield too. We've got streamers from UAE, France, India, China, Pakistan, Nepal, and Japan. So from wherever you are streaming, thank you so much for tuning in and participating in this most important conversation. As I say, this is the second session of a 4-day symposium. So today, and again on Wednesday and Thursday at this time, we'll continue the conversation we started yesterday. Yesterday, our focus was on the impacts of COVID, like other major global disruptions, on educational systems and on education policy and practice. Today, we narrow the focus to policies and practices of inclusion in education and what we're learning about inclusive education through the upheaval and trauma caused by COVID. As I mentioned yesterday, we're very conscious that different countries in the ASEAN region are experiencing different trajectories in grappling with the pandemic. Some are recording very few new cases of COVID in recent weeks, and that's tremendous. Others, of course, are struggling with escalating numbers of new diagnoses and recent deaths. And I want to say again here, our thoughts are with those of you streaming from those areas. We encourage you, wherever you are, to be active participants in this symposium conversation, to extend the discussion by asking questions of the presenters and our panelists via the YouTube comments and chat section on your screen. And don't forget, you'll need to be logged on to YouTube to be able to post your questions. And we encourage you to participate in the conversation through social media. You can use any of the following hashtags: hashtag ASEAN 2021, hashtag educational leadership, hashtag research in action, and tagging @Monash Education on Twitter. Okay, now onto the focus for tonight's session: inclusive education in a post-COVID world. Like yesterday's session, our plan is to support a rich conversation amongst the presenters and our audience, but this session will be structured a little differently. We'll begin with 3 separate presentations from academics in Australia, and then Brunei, and then Vietnam, so that we hear a range of perspectives on inclusion in education. From there, we'll expand the conversation and include the reflections of a panelist from the Philippines. And in the last half hour or so, we'll open up the conversation to questions from you, our audience, spread out across the world in YouTube land. And we'll be relying on you to post your questions on the chat function of YouTube. Okay, now, as we get to each presentation, I'll introduce each of the different presenters just before they begin their presentation. So let's get started. It's my great pleasure to call upon 2 of my wonderful colleagues from the Faculty of Education here at Monash to give the first presentation. Dr. Pearl Subban is a senior lecturer in educational psychology and inclusive education in Monash's Faculty of Education. Welcome, Pearl. And also from Monash's Faculty of Education, I welcome Professor Umesh Sharma, Professor of Psychology and Inclusive Education, and Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion in that faculty. We look forward to hearing from you both, Pearl and Umesh. So over to you, and I'll move the slides on, and please just let me know when you need a slide moved.
Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of the conversation on accommodating student diversity during the pandemic. Perhaps I should preface what I'm going to say by telling you that the focal point for us during the online teaching experiences was all about creating communities. In fact, it goes without saying that COVID-19 presented a challenge to education both locally here in Australia and globally. Wherever you are in the world, you are probably feeling the impact of COVID-19, some more intensively than others. However, the challenge for students with disabilities was perhaps more profound, especially since they are already a marginalized population. One of the key platforms that everyone utilized during the pandemic would be that offered by technology, and the medium that we are using today is testimony to that. Of course, it was provided that this was accessible to the student during their learning programs. It wasn't accessible to everyone. And when we think about that idea, the online space, the online learning space had to be transformed into a community in which the well-being of students became paramount. So in other words, it was as important to foster good relationships in that online space as it would have been during a face-to-face classroom session. And I've got as one of my key highlighted points on my slide, the idea that it was Maslow before Bloom. And many of you who are teachers would know the reference point there, Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Bloom's taxonomy. And you realize that if you look at the essential nature of both, in the case of students with disabilities particularly, we had to respond to their needs as human beings first. That's in regard to their physical, their emotional, and their social comfort. This was a vital initial step. And it is only when these elements are in place that a teacher could actually shift to focusing on academic outcomes. So it was all about responding first to those needs that the student had. And many of you might be visualizing Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you know, the large pyramid with the basis being creating that development around belonging and identity and finding their spaces and finding their belonging and their identity in that huge space of the online learning classroom. For students with disabilities, the idea of creating incremental milestones were absolutely significant and vital to the process. And we had to celebrate these as time progressed. It was fundamental to their success. So even small gains had to be celebrated. It was simply a case of doing your personal best in every situation. During the pandemic, and if you were a parent, you would bear me out on this one, parents had to often step in as both the teacher and the teacher aide in order to provide support to the student to ensure that routines were established and routines were maintained and work was being done in that capacity of being supportive. Essentially, we would know this personally as well. The need for a community in that space became pivotal to successful inclusion during the pandemic. Can we move to the next slide, Graham? All right, so building on the ideas that I just talked about, I think it was vital for all concerned that the students' well-being adopted a first-place priority. We had to adopt that village mindset. And if you remember what we talked about just through the first slide, it does take a village to raise a child. It was not about what was being done, but how it was being done. And therefore, personalized learning and individual pacing of that personalized learning became essential to the online classroom. Nurturing the student was a significant element, especially as parents considered emotional and physical well-being to be perhaps the most crucial factor during virtual teaching. It was about accommodating the student first and their academic outcomes second. Interestingly, the pandemic did offer some opportunities for more personalized instruction, especially since education support staff were being used more creatively in the online classroom. Support staff could offer individualized support during using a video conferencing platform like the one we're using now, and they could engage students using creative visual means. Sometimes these opportunities are not as available during a face-to-face meeting. If we think about it, the pandemic was an equalizer for all students. And on some interesting level, students with disabilities found a voice among their peers who might have also been experiencing that disengagement during online teaching. Subsequently, some of them would have found that communication in the online learning space might have been actually better than it would have been had they been physically in a classroom. Having a voice in that space was also very important to them. Again, that nurturing village mindset. Now, in everything that I've said, I'm not suggesting that any of this was easy or plain sailing. In fact, those of us who have been in classrooms will know that change and challenge were the order of the day. But I think creating these nurturing communities, especially for students with disabilities, would have helped and would certainly help even in the days post-COVID, where we understood that it doesn't just take one person to actually educate and nurture a child, it does take the village. So there's a whole lot of us occupying different identities who will step up into that space. I'm going to hand you over now to Umesh, who's going to finish up our presentation from Monash Education. So over to you, Umesh.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pearl. I would like to welcome all of you once again. And our prayers are with all of you wherever you are in the world. We know the whole world is going through COVID-19 and some of you might be more affected than others. So first, I think we want to acknowledge that, people are going through difficult times and our prayers are with all of you. I would like to share with you, we conducted a study during this time and what did we learn from that study? So we asked teachers or we asked parents or students to nominate a teacher in different countries. We said, can you identify a teacher in your country through Facebook or social media that is making a difference in your life? And we conducted this study in 6 or 7 countries. So India, Bangladesh, Australia, New Zealand, Spain, Italy, and Austria. And we wanted to know, is there something common amongst those teachers who were in different countries who were making a difference? So interestingly, what we found, the teachers who were making a difference for all kids or for some kids were those teachers who were very inclusive in their philosophy, in the way they were teaching. And there were some common themes came from different countries. And we have highlighted those themes in this particular slide. They were caring. So what does it mean? What do I mean by caring? These teachers were making connection with the student. They cared for a student, but they understood that a student needs, the learners need to, in a school, you are interacting with other kids. When you are at home, you are on your own. So what do I do as a teacher? They started caring for these teachers by making sure that students had connections. They could interact with other kids. They were helping to form new relationships. But the most important thing these teachers were doing, they were forming relationships with the families too. So that's the important thing we learned. And that was true across different countries, not just in Australia. It was true even in Bangladesh or in India. The second thing we learned, which is also true, is they were creative teachers. So these teachers knew that, during these times, inclusion requires a lot of resources. Inclusion requires for teachers to understand that resources are not always available. So what do? As a teacher, you become more creative. You say, for example, think about in Bangladesh, how I'm going to reach to my students. What these teachers did, they formed a WhatsApp group where they could talk to parents, they could talk to other teachers, and they could talk to their students. So they were more creative in the way they were teaching these kids. And that happened across different countries. So that was a common characteristics of teachers who were making a great difference in their classrooms. And the last thing we found that all these teachers, they were passionate. They believed in inclusion. They believed that if a learner in my classroom, if you have a classroom of 26 kids, there are some kids who are going to struggle. They cared about those kids and they wanted to make sure that those kids are not excluded during these times. So I can give you one example from Australia. I know there were some teachers here, they drove to the students' families and they took internet dongle because they realized that families may not have internet connection. because they believed in inclusion, they were passionate about this idea, they made sure that all kids had access to technology and they were connected. So the key lesson that we have learned from COVID-19, which will be true even beyond COVID-19, is if you want to be, we needed to be more inclusive and more creative. So think about before COVID-19, if we were doing it really well, we started doing it even more during COVID-19. So 3 lessons: be more caring, be creative resource finder, and be passionate about inclusion. If we continue to do this anywhere in the world, we can include all learners in our classroom. So thank you very much. I'll now move it to, that's where we conclude our presentation from Monash University. I hand it over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Pearl and Umesh. That was tremendous. Yes, some really very powerful learnings in terms of the importance of caring, creativity, and passion. There's plenty for us to think about there, but we're going to go on to our next presentation. And so I'd now like to introduce to you Dr. Siti Nohedaya Abdul Latif from Brunei. A warm welcome to you, Siti. Siti is an assistant professor and program leader for graduate professional development at Sultan Hassan Al Bolkiah Institute of Education in University Brunei Darussalam. Siti, we look forward to hearing your thoughts about inclusive education in Brunei during the time of COVID and what you've learned from these experiences. Over to you, Siti.
Hi, Graham. Thank you for the introduction. Took a quick look here from Brunei Darussalam context. Would like to bring you to the first slide here. I just want to showcase what it looks like during the COVID-19, several initiatives that was done by the special education unit, the officers. I'm sure that a lot of the practices were quite similar with other countries. We also had the school operation protocol metrics of total homeschool-based learning, which happened sometime last time in March 2020, to study at school plan, which kick off in June from once a week to 4 days a week. Now, beside that, the escalation stage by the Ministry of Education, schools were also given the option actually to follow their business continuity plan. So what it means here that while majority of the schools are following closely the stages of going back to school, some schools would actually consider a group of students which will have to continue doing study from back home, especially students with special needs, because I agree with what Dr. Pearl has said just now. She mentioned that it's important to address the psychological needs of the students first before we meet before they understand in meeting their own academic needs. Now, as you can see in the slides, there are 4 big areas where the special education initiative, which looks closely during the COVID-19 to ensure that there's a continuity of education takes place. The individualized education plan here looks very closely in the meeting the needs, the planning, and also customization a lot of the learning material for the students. We also have this the online learning material shared by the special education unit through the Ministry of Education web portal, which is accessible for public use. And they also continue when at times parents had to actually collect this home learning package. So here teachers who were dealing with special needs children, they were really preparing a lot of materials, which was mostly hands-on to help parents to ensure that they were able to monitor the progress of the students' learning. They also ensure that the school-based team, so the school-based team here comprise of the parents, the teachers, special education teachers, as well as the principal. So they were the major key focal group or individuals here to ensure that there's always an exchange on the updates of information, consultation with one another. And again, the purpose is to ensure the development of this learning to take place. And finally, training is actually also provided by the special education unit. And this will take place at the Brunei Darussalam Teacher Academy. With regards to not just how to use the technology, but hopefully this will take with full force soon, because the training has actually been realized not only during the COVID-19, but before the COVID-19, there was also a call for more training in terms of how we can deliver the learning to students with special needs. Now, on to my next slide, Ryan. So a quick look at what it is like now in Brunei with post-COVID in inclusive education. Now, all students from August 2020 are now back to school. So I think it's important for us, everyone, to actually come to realize that we shouldn't be too relaxed with the current situation. It's just because that we do not have any local cases for so long, but we do have import cases, but that's still under manageable. It's still being manageable by the medical team. So I think it's important that the Ministry of Education, the community, the parents, the teachers continue to include this lifelong learning strategy to ensure that these students will continue to get access to learning for cases if, for example, we are hit with the second wave, which we hope not so, right? And also there is teachers, we notice that teachers becoming very creative. Okay, learning can take place at their own comfort, and also we heard just now the use of the WhatsApp and the spike use of Zoom, which was reported in the news last year. And although teachers have been using a lot of this assisted technology available online, I think they do realize that they still need a proper equipped in terms of the training. So the training here is not on how to use the Zoom apps and the other online platform, but I think teachers were calling into other educational learning activities, because some teachers do actually disclose that they were feeling a little bit frustrated because they found that the learning objective was not fully achievable when it was done through the virtual learning with the students. So we hope that training would focus more on how learning can actually be transferred, how it can be more efficient, and hopefully training can look into other learning or more friendly virtual application that's available, and that is maybe less expensive for parents maybe to subscribe to ensure the continuity of the learning to take place. Now, there's also, they continue also to provide learning packages, especially for those with severe students with special needs. And they do realize that there is a challenge when they continue to do this, because they prefer, parents, the students and the teacher still prefer face-to-face physical interaction in order to observe any progress of learning. And finally, the online material, yes, it's actually available at the Ministry of Education website. But the question is now to what extent that it's been used by the public, especially by the parents with students with special needs. And also we have to take into consideration some parents with a limitation in terms of where they do not have resources such as the laptops. So we need to consider how we ensure that this inclusivity will not miss out these parents from getting the access of learning. The last point here, the positive outcome of this COVID. One clear positive outcome that we and the special educational officer noticed that, this is what I gather, parents were very engaging during the process of this learning activity. And when it happened, they were very involved, and the teaching of their own kids at home made them actually realize and appreciate the teacher more in terms of what the teacher had actually invested in the past and even today towards the learning of their own children. So when parents actually did this home package learning at home, and when they experienced success, this actually made them feel very happy, and that we see there's an improvement in the parents-teacher relationship, which was not very evident before the COVID-19. I think that's all from me, Graham. Thank you for listening. We hope to Brunei hope to learn more the learning opportunities with how we can deal with inclusive education in Brunei. Thank you, Graham.
Thank you so much, Siti. That was so interesting. I'm particularly interested in what was involved in the online and home learning package. It sounds a very, very valuable resource indeed. Okay. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Tuan Huyn, and just move the slide on. Tuan is the Dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies in Vietnam National University and lecturer in applied linguistics in the University of Languages and International Studies within VNU. Tuan, welcome. I'm particularly interested to find out how COVID has impacted upon inclusion practices in Vietnam. Over to you, Tuan.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. The message that I would like to convey in my presentation somewhat echoes Dr. Porn Subin and Professor Umesh Sharma's conclusion in their presentation. There is a more inclusive education for the more vulnerable. The more vulnerable in the Vietnamese education context in the COVID-19 and even in the post-COVID period include children, youth, students with disability, autistic children, and even the ethnic minority students in mountainous areas in Vietnam. This group is also taken as the more vulnerable due to their geographical and economic living conditions. They live in the mountainous areas along the border with China, Laos, and Cambodia, and the chances for their staying out of our formal education are very high. So now I would like to briefly depict the situation and some challenges facing the inclusive education in Vietnam before, during, and after the COVID-19 pandemic. For the time being, more than 8 million Vietnamese people, accounting for 7.8% of the population, are suffering from various forms of disability, and even the disabilities resulting from the Agent Orange syndrome. Many policy reformations have been issued to facilitate inclusive education in Vietnam, such as the abolition of a national regulation preventing or barring children with disability from preschools in 1997, or the law granting children with disabilities the option of attending either special or regular schools in 1998. And this marked a shift in public philosophical stance on inclusive education. Many achievements have been recorded since the introduction of the inclusive education policy for Vietnam, such as community awareness and support for children with disabilities, the development of infrastructures for inclusive education, inclusive and age-appropriate placement in natural proportions, or the improved quality of teaching and attitudes towards children with disabilities, and the increased family support and the overall improvement in the educational lives of children with disabilities. And Vietnam is currently ranked the most inclusive in terms of education of children and youth with disabilities of all the Asian countries. And this is a statement made in an article entitled Inclusive Education, More Than a Quarter Centuries of Implementation by a group of Vietnamese researchers working in collaboration with an international researcher. And I myself find this very surprising. However, the provision for inclusive education in Vietnam is still limited, including early detection and early intervention services. In other words, children and youth with disabilities have a limited access to any form of formal schooling. And this limit has been exacerbated by the COVID-19, with the burden on general education being heavier, pushing children with disabilities into even more critical vulnerability, or in other words, keeping them on the edge of the society, or with even more limited opportunities, and they are more in the marginalization in education. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently claimed that people with disabilities in Vietnam are among those most affected by the COVID-19 situation. Before the pandemic, the literacy rate in Vietnam are much lower for adult persons with disabilities, only 76.3% than those without disabilities. That is 95.2%. And based on the information provided by WHO, there is only 0.1% of the total people with disabilities in Vietnam obtain a bachelor degree, and only 6.5% have certificate of professional practicing, certificate allowing them to secure a job. So there are several causes of this situation. First is the irrelevant view of inclusive education of the society, the school, teachers, administrators, and even the parents, who often view the children with disabilities as burden to the society or sources of shame or pity, rather than people who are eligible to the full right to education. And the typical image associated with children with disabilities in Vietnam is one of abnormality and helplessness. So that's the first reason. The second cause is the lack of collaboration and concern among the many social parties. There has not been much collaboration among the law making, policy implementation, the schools, the parents, and even the researchers. So this includes lack of accurate data on people with disabilities, which has led to the underestimation of the challenges children with disabilities are facing before, during, and after the pandemic, and consequently the inadequacies in social reactions to supporting them properly and timely. So my message for the future, taking the impact of the COVID-19 into consideration, more inclusive education for the more vulnerable. And thirdly, there must be more inclusive policy, research, financial or technical support, or even infrastructure on the many laws, regulations, policies for children or students with disabilities have been issued for or reformed or even amended there is still a big gap between our expectations and the reality, between policies and practices and the implementation of policy. And apart from amending or issuing policy to make education more and more inclusive for the disabled, there must be a more nationwide research project, investigating the impact of the COVID-19 on inclusive education for children or students with disabilities. Second, there should be a kind of social shift in attitudes toward the perspectives of inclusive education. The society in general need to hold a more inclusive attitude toward the perspective of education for children with disabilities, especially among their more advantageous peers, to avoid any form of bullying or coercion, which might leave permanent psychological injuries in the children with disability. And taking care of or ensuring social equalities for children with disabilities must be viewed as the responsibility and the desire of the community, rather than just a feeling of sympathy or empathy or philanthropy. It is to make a more inclusive environment in the society for students or children with disabilities. And third, there must be more multilateral or multi-layered collaboration between parents, schools, the government, social organizations such as the Women's Union or the Farmers Union, the Red Cross, and some non-governmental organization or the United Nations organization such as the UNICEF and some religious organization. Up to now, the Vietnam Post and Telecommunication Group, a very big corporate group in Vietnam, has offered free internet for over 43,000 schools and free learning management system and account for all the schools in Vietnam. Fourth, there must be more inclusive education during school closure. That is because children with disabilities rely on more classroom support staff and who use learning aids and equipment which are not made available at home during school closure. And they are more likely to be left behind in the online learning. And the longer the school closure, the more likely the risk of their being dropped out of our formal education. And finally, there should be more inclusive return to school reopenings. It is much more challenging for children or students with disabilities to be re-included after school closure. And they may not be able to return to school, to stay at home to care for family members who are also disabled or have become unwell from the COVID-19. And even if they are able to return to school, it is much harder for them to catch up with their peers in every aspect of their learning without due support from their parents, the teachers, and their friends. And therefore, more effort is required to guarantee or to facilitate a more inclusive return to school. And to conclude my presentation, I would like to show my love, for the two statements officially announced by the Vietnamese government. No exceptions and no child is left behind in the COVID-19, and children are at the heart of the COVID-19 response. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Prayer.
Graham, you will need to unmute.
Thank you so much, Toon. It's so interesting to hear how inclusion is being experienced differently in different parts of the world and between different countries, even in the ASEAN region. It's we've got some comments coming in from the audience, and I think this is pretty interesting. This guy was suggesting the same thing. It looks as if we're tackling the same issues with varying degrees of success, says Guy. Sadly, many of the challenges are out of the control of individual institutions or teachers. but Guy thinks we are making progress on inclusivity. And another from Rangrat Charasmwisal, sorry for my mispronunciation. Rangrat says it's important for inclusive education for post-COVID, but some students and parents lack of IT skills and lack the equipment needed to be able to help. And it makes me think that whether that online and home learning package that Siti spoke about, whether that might be valuable or important in a range of different contexts. Anyway, look, thank you very much for all of your presentations. That's been very rich and interesting so far. At this point of time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and that means that we can all appear back on our screen here. I think everyone's got their videos on now. Well, they're just putting them on now, so that's tremendous. Thank you all for those such interesting and rich presentations. I'd like now to bring the conversation, bring into our conversation our esteemed panelists from the Philippines, Dr. Jenny Hocson. Jenny is currently the Vice President for Academics in Philippine National University. Philippine Normal University, the country's national center for teacher education. Previously, she held the position of Deputy Director at the Philippine National Research Center for Teacher Quality. So welcome, Jenny, into the conversation. Can I just say that at this stage, where our plan is to have a rich conversation between panelists and presenters, and then in about 15 minutes, we'll open it up to questions from our audience members and our streamers. But Jenny, if I can just start with you. You've been listening to these wonderful presentations from Pearl, Umesh, Siti, and Toon, and I'm wondering how their perspectives on inclusion in education connect with your experience in the Philippines. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you, Graham. Certainly wonderful discussions from our colleagues and sharing of different perspectives. But I'd like to agree with the comment you just read a while ago, that certainly there are similarities to how things are being run and how things are being experienced in several countries. Definitely in the Philippines, these are conditions and inclusivity, or the lack of inclusivity. But I'd like to focus on the context that these things are all familiar to us, meaning pre-COVID, these are all conditions of lack of or support to inclusive education. And with the COVID, certainly in the Philippines, things were magnified. The conditions of non-inclusivity is really magnified back here. And as hearing from you guys, I think it's just around the world. And the concern now is that all of a sudden we view inclusive education as that really difficult paradigm in education. While we're winning at some levels, definitely there's a lot of other concerns that we have not looked into. Back here, it's like our policies are here. There are policies on inclusive education, but all of a sudden we realize they're not working. They're not working down to the grassroots. Our teachers are not well equipped and well prepared to address all of this inclusive education. Inclusivity in the classroom. Definitely our students in the lower socioeconomic status are very much affected by the pandemic. So I think in the whole perspective of inclusive education, there's a lot to be dealt with, and the pandemic has shown more of where we are lacking rather than where we are winning. Our teachers need the full support, our carers need the full support, and same as Vietnam, there's a big push in the Philippines that no student is left behind. But I'd like to add, because the Philippine Normal University is a pre-service teacher education, that's our space in education. I'd like to add that no teacher is left behind, that we support our teachers along the way, because they are our big warriors, our strong warriors for education and inclusive education. Thanks, Graham.
Thank you indeed, Jenny. That's wonderful, interesting perspectives that you bring there already. And you're absolutely correct. Those of us in teacher education feel like we're right in the spotlight, in the center. We're also in a position to be able to have a great deal of influence, and that's one of the positive things that's coming out of this. Okay, what I'd like to do now is to open it up to questions and comments from within the presenters, or Jenny, you are also welcome to come back in if you'd like, and when you'd like. We've got about 10 minutes or so for a conversation. So please feel free to indicate if you'd like to make a comment or raise a question, and indicate to whom you'd like to ask that question, or if it's to all of the panel, then by all means do it that way. So I thought I would just mention one other comment that's come in from an audience member, Jay, who suggested disruption in education brought about by COVID-19 emphasizes the importance of forging strong parent and community collaboration in educating all children. And I think that was a theme that was brought up by all of our presenters, and that's clearly a very powerful one. So is there anybody who would like to kick off our discussion here before we take it out to our audience to hear from their questions?
Can I go, Graham?
Please, Jenny, yes.
Yes, thank you. This goes to, well, particularly Pearl, but everybody could just come in there. In the slide, Pearl, earlier, you shared about to Maslow first before to bloom, right? To Maslow before we bloom, no? And all of a sudden, it gives us that knee-jerk reaction that we have been blooming. Apologies for putting it in the, we've been blooming for so long a time. All of a sudden, we're bringing ourselves back to Maslowing, okay? So certainly it is a conversation in the Philippines. It is a conversation that will open our eyes that maybe this is where we need to focus our attention first, because we could not move forward to blooming without focusing on that. Is that where the logic of conversation and the focus of conversation is? Thank you.
Oh, yes, definitely. That's a very good point, Jenny. And you would have noticed that a common thread that ran through all ours, and even the comments you made earlier, is the collaboration that needs to happen between parents and the teachers and the support staff, and perhaps even the school leadership. So everyone was, Tuan and Siti and Umesh said exactly the same things. So I think using those, and of course we've turned it into verbs now, so the idea of blooming and Maslowing, I think that's probably the idea for us to be thinking more about the student needs. And if we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, fundamental to that is the idea of belonging. And for the student with a disability, having to find their identity within a space where they feel like they belong and they find their identity in that, that's so fundamental to inclusive education. So I think, yes, you're right, Jenny, pre-service teacher institutions, I think, will probably be focusing on that it's all about the well-being first, and then the academic outcomes come second. So we Maslow afterwards. Oh, we Maslow first and then we bloom afterwards. That's true. Anyway, I'll allow the rest of the panel to add on as well.
Anybody else want to speak in support of Maslow?
Yeah, if I may add, Graham.
Please, Siti. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Pearl. I like where you bring in the Maslow theory, because the Maslow theory has been existing for a long history in the psychological needs, meeting the needs of the students. And then only when the COVID happens, it hits us that we realize that we paid too much attention on the blooming on the academic side of the students, that we overlook into this the psychological needs of belonging as well as trust. I think that would be one of the learning opportunities that a lot of stakeholders and the Ministry of Education should consider in terms of the well-being of the students, which is should be our utmost priority when we talk about education, balancing it with the academic sides of the learning. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Siti.
Something, Graham? Yes.
Yes, please.
So when Siti mentioned the well-being of the children with disability, and I think also about the psychological or the mental health of the children with disability, like, because I have a very close friend of mine, and she has a child with disability, and she's always proud of him, ongoing, say that I'm so proud of you, and she gives him, praises in every little achievement that he makes, and that makes him, very proud of himself. And it seems that he has forgotten all about the adversities, that he has in his life. And I think the psychological aspect of children with disabilities, must be, pay attention to. Thank you. That's my.
Yeah, thank you, Toon. Can I just ask a question? It was interesting in Toon's presentation, the suggestion that one of the positives to come out of COVID was a seemingly greater attention to and appreciation of the challenges of the vulnerable, including disabled, but vulnerable in so many different ways. I'm just wondering whether other people perceive that that COVID has had this perhaps unexpected positive outcome, in that there has been an elevated level of awareness and appreciation of the challenges of the most vulnerable in our communities. I put that to anybody on the screen. Umesh, what do you think?
Oh, okay. Go for it, Umesh.
I think that there were two aspects during COVID-19. I mean, one of the things that we realized, inclusion requires for teachers to change things all the time. They need to modify, they need to adjust the way they teach. And some very interesting things happened during this time, actually, that we did not expect will happen. Teachers started recording their lessons. They were not doing it before. Mm-hmm. And what some students found, or some families found, that this was a very good adjustment for students, that if teachers could make, like this is also post-COVID-19, it makes such a good difference, like will continue to make. So think about, in the past, we will teach something, we'll move away, and student will say, I did not understand what to do it. But during COVID-19, teachers started recording their lessons. So what happened as a result of this, when students were at home, they could go rewind the lesson. They could think about, okay, how to do it. So actually it worked really well for some of the students who were struggling in the past. And this was a discovery, this was not anticipated, but we learned something from COVID-19, which was very positive. So even though it was a challenge in the past where teachers say, how will I do it? So two things happen. Number one, they say, okay, how about I record this lesson, send it to the family? So they form one thing, they form connection with the family. The second thing that happened for the student, they could use this adjustment because they could learn the same lesson by rewinding, and it really helped them to scaffold. And, so there were lots of things happening for students that were not happening in the past. And I think they will continue to happen in the future. So that's post-COVID-19 will be such a good thing for us to continue to do. So, sorry, Pearl, you wanted to say something too.
Oh, no, thanks, Umesh. I think you kind of captured that really well, because I do think the idea of personalized learning came to the forefront during COVID. And I think it's probably something that will survive post-COVID as well, because students could actually learn at their own pace. So, when a classroom was on, if they paused for a moment in order to get some work done, the student wasn't under pressure to perform in the class as they would in the classroom, with the background noise and other students around them bustling and so on. It was a case of being quiet and perhaps just with a parent for support in that space and nobody else. And therefore that personalized learning became quite important during that time. But capturing what Umesh is saying as well, that, the idea of recording a lesson and then listening to it, as you would a YouTube video, as many students do nowadays, became really important, a visual resource for them afterwards.
Thank you.
I quite agree with Pearl, because it is something to do with learner autonomy. Many years ago, the level of learner autonomy in Vietnam was very low. And thanks to this pandemic, students are becoming more and more autonomous with that learning. Thank you.
That's interesting. So anybody else on the screen would like to raise a question or make a comment just in reflecting on the other presentations that we've had?
I just want to add what something Jenny talked about, which makes such a good sense. It was COVID-19 was not just about students, it was also about teachers. And we should not forget how much they have changed. And, they were also very vulnerable. Teachers needed support. We need to recognize it. actually they were, I mean, if you think about it, in most countries, they were working so hard to make sure that kids were engaged during this time. Mm-hmm. And if the kids were not engaged, the families will not be engaged, and families will, going through so much of mental health issues. So they worked so hard all around the world. And in some ways, we need to, I think, somehow to acknowledge the contributions they have made throughout the world. And we need to be careful how, we need to make sure that we look after this for them really well now as well as in the future, because they change quickly, but they were also very vulnerable because they have kids, they have families. So while they were doing all those things, so we need to keep that in mind. And I think some of the lessons that we have learned from all over the world, actually school leaders made a big difference because they were supporting these teachers really well. Mm-hmm. And the systems were changing, providing that support. So wherever they have done it really well, schools were providing better services and they were more inclusive. So, and teachers were also helping each other too. Like, they were helping. This is what happened a lot during COVID-19, because one teacher said, can you please help me take over my lesson? So they could co-design the lesson, but they could also help each other. And Zoom allowed, or the technology allowed you to do it. So we were, that's the idea behind more creative, but also more resourceful, but also more supportive during this time.
Thank you, Umesh. Yes, it certainly occurs to me that that dimension of teachers also being under pressure and vulnerable is sometimes an underappreciated one. But your comment about leadership encourages me to make a quick advertisement for tomorrow at this time, when the focus in the symposium will be on leadership and COVID and what we're learning about leadership through COVID. So thanks for prompting that advertisement just then, Umesh. But all right, back to inclusive education and COVID-19. I think we're at the stage now when we can we're almost ready to go back to the audience for some questions from them, but maybe we've got time for one more comment or question from the panel in front of me.
We've had one very positive comment from one of our YouTube streamers to say that we are making progress on inclusive education, it's really affirming to hear that, because you think of a time during a pandemic when it was a setback for the entire world. And I know many countries, as we know today as well, are still grappling with the intensity of it all. And the fact that we are having productive conversations like this is such a good testimony to that we've actually survived through that very difficult period. And we've actually learned some lessons and, come out on the other side. We're not emerging unscathed. We haven't come through and said, oh, it's been absolutely smooth. It's been challenging for everyone. But the good thing about it is that we're taking away such interesting, creative ideas about how to equip our students in the next chapter after COVID. And we know that there's going to be a chapter after COVID. So we'll hang on to that.
Indeed. I'm not quite sure when the COVID chapter is going to finish at this stage, but we look forward to that time when it does finish and we can think about a world beyond that. But yeah, indeed. Look, thank you very much to all of our panelists and presenters. I think now we might move to questions from the audience. I know that there are many questions being posed and even comments as we've been having this discussion amongst ourselves now. So I think I'll hand over to Chantal and Rebecca, and can we hear some questions that you've selected from the ones that the audiences have posted on YouTube?
Thanks, Graham. We do have a lot of questions coming through, and we've got Sesh on deck as well to help today. So with the first question we've got for the panel from Guy. And he's asking, there's a lot of changes being made under the umbrella of COVID. Is there any real intention to revert back as and when, or is it being used to force needed but unwelcome change?
Gee, there's a lot in that question. That's a really crucial question. Thank you very much for your question, Guy. So yes, if change is happening, is it just going to flick back when COVID has finished? I can think of some instances in Australia where that's happening. The first thing that comes to mind is national numeracy and literacy testing which was not here for 1 year and back again now that COVID is finished, to our great dismay. But has anybody else seen some instances of change that had happened during COVID that flipped back after COVID has happened, or have you got some more positive stories of COVID changes that have endured and will continue on into the future, such as what Pearl and Umesh were talking about?
Yeah, hi Graham. Me from Brunei here would like to share something.
Please, Siti.
Because the COVID impacted Brunei with very less cases for such a long time. So I guess here a lot of the community, the Ministry of Education are taking this opportunity to go back to this face-to-face teaching while we still have this opportunity. So like I said, it's important to ensure that we're not being too relaxed, because this pandemic is unpredictable, and I think it's important that we still continue some form of this online learning. It can happen in school. It doesn't mean that it's just the use of through the PowerPoint slides. I mean, a teacher can introduce these quizzes, maybe, for example, in the classroom, or teacher can be remote, maybe in a different in a staff room to the teaching, and ensure that students are comfortable doing their own learning in their own pace. I think there are other opportunities that we need to explore rather than too dependent on going back, too comfortable on going back to the old way of teaching. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Siti. Yes, Umesh.
I just want to add what Siti talked about. One interesting thing happened during this time. Some schools started collecting data about attendance rates for students, all students, and including for students with a disability. And what they found, there were some students who were absent in the past before COVID-19, were present now, or they were attending online lessons more frequently than they were doing in the past. So some people are really interested in why that was happening. So these were some of the students who were socially withdrawn in the past. They realized actually this medium really helped them because somehow they could interact more frequently with the teacher. So Guy, the question is whether we'll go back to this or not. But what we do realize, some schools have already recognized the value of the technology, but also some of the adjustments we have made during this time. And there is a good chance some of the practices that we have learned from COVID-19 might continue beyond COVID-19, because what we realized, some of the students who were not engaged in the past, they could be engaged more using technology and some adjustments that schools have made during this time. And I'll be surprised that if things have worked for some students, why can't we continue to have them in the future? So I have a feeling some of those things will continue in the future, but a change to happen at policy level takes time. Sometimes practices change policies, sometimes policies change practice. I have a feeling that practices this time will change policies. Yeah. And I think the whole world will look different, the way we're going to educate, but also the way we're going to support our educators to support learners who have diverse learning needs or difficulties.
That's great when practice changes policy. That's tremendous. Any other instances of change that's happened that you fear might flip back or endure? There's another comment, just Umesh, you just finished speaking. There's one of our audience members wanted to express their appreciation that you had recognized the effort of teachers and educators and special educators during this challenging time. And I think we all agree with that. Okay, maybe another question, Chantal or Seshna?
Yes. Hi, Graham. So this is a comment and a question from Jay. So as mentioned by Jenny earlier, there should also be no teacher left behind. It will be interesting to know how this disruption in education systems would impact teacher education. So Jay was interested to hear from the panelists about what measures and changes have been done in their countries in regards to teacher education in response to COVID.
That's a really interesting question. We might have a response from a few of our different panelists or presenters. Who wants to start?
Maybe
Jenny.
I can start, Graham. Yeah. What's happening in the Philippines is that, well, we've had this many conversations between what the expectations of the ground on the ground is in terms of the expectations of teachers and how the pre-service teacher education institutions are supporting that. But with the pandemic, it became now more inclusive, right? It becomes now the focus because we find our teachers having difficulty adjusting in the ground. And as I think it was Omesho mentioned, that there are also mothers, there are also parents, there are also carers, not their own children. And to take care of the family in the COVID challenges is doubly difficult, not for them to take care of other children. And so that conversation between the pre-service teacher education and back here, we call it the Department of Education, which is the biggest employer of our teachers, becomes now very obvious. And now we look at the different contextualization that wasn't there in the early conversation pre-COVID, meaning the way we view education is sort of a one size fits all, and the country is an archipelago. We have 1 million teachers. So our problems are really magnified to the 100 level. There are 1 million teachers in the basic education, and the way we see education sometimes is a one size fits all thing rather than diverse, rather than inclusive. Now it becomes the conversations leading towards that level of inclusivity across our teachers also. So second point that I'd like to discuss is that back in the Philippines, it's now more in the engagements between policymakers and how they are brought down to the ground, to the grassroots, is happening at the national level. And we've not seen that in the previous years, in recent years. All of a sudden, everybody who's a policymaker who can make changes in the national level, all of a sudden are interested on education, because we find that it's the biggest and most important contribution that all of us could do. So I think that's what we are learning in the Philippines.
Thank you, Jenny. Toon, or can you think of some ways in which teacher education is changing? I know that's not necessarily your area, so.
The biggest change in teacher education is we need more like the technological skill, like before, Vietnamese teachers were not very skillful with using technologies, but due to this, COVID-19, and then the Vietnamese government paid more attention to equipping the teachers with more like technological knowledge and skill. And even for the elderly teachers, like many years ago, the old teachers were scattered using technology for online teaching. But thanks to the COVID-19, many of them are now are accustomed to teaching online, and they can consider it as one big achievement in their life, because they are old now. They say, oh, thanks to the COVID-19, I'm now more accustomed to using the technology for online teaching. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sure that everybody who teaches in teacher education would say that they're even those people who, as you say, were reluctantly brought screaming into the technological age. Every one of them has had to learn a skill and developed a dimension of knowledge which they didn't have before. So that's got to be a positive, which is about addressing the diversity of our learners. So that's a clear benefit. So thanks for that, Toon. Siti, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, with regards to teacher education, we are teaching at a master program level. So we are actually the teacher training center, the faculty at the university. So when this all happened, we did actually, before the COVID, prepared students with a lot of the assignments, for example, and the actual learning which can take place online. And I agree with what was said earlier, that we have senior staff who are actually quite reluctant to use this technology because of the fear of not knowing, the unfamiliarity of using the tool. But now it's at their comfort. They're more confident in using the tool. And assessment also with regards to teaching at the master program benefit a lot of us, the staff, where now we can use, for example, Canvas. We use a lot of Canvas in our teaching. So a lot of the material can be recorded, and a lot of the quizzes, some of the discussion can take place through the use of the Canvas itself. So somehow we hope that when the teacher graduates from our university, they are well equipped with this younger generation who are more savvy tech, and they hope to actually work closely with their mentor or their seniors back in school when they find placement, to convince these teachers that how this can be actually be more friendly if they are willing to learn. Yeah.
Thank you, Siti. Yes, Umesh.
So thank you very much. I think this could be true for most of our audience around the world. Like teacher education, one of the major challenges we faced, how are we going to provide practicum training to our teachers? And that was one of the major challenges I think all countries faced. So some of the things that we have done in Australia at Monash University, what we try to do is, number one, we brought teachers in our classroom because you can bring them through Zoom technology. They can come and co-teach with you. But the second interesting thing that happened, we asked some of our students from our classrooms or our pre-service teachers to go and co-teach with the teachers when they were teaching in Zoom classroom. So it was innovation happening during these times, which again, I think will continue beyond COVID-19. So teacher education has changed to some extent. Some of the things that the challenges that we faced came up with some solutions from the industry, like, where teachers started talking about what can we do and how universities can collaborate with schools. We started co-teaching, but we also started doing placements during COVID classrooms through Zoom and other media, other technology, when they were co-teaching the classroom and they were learning how to use technology to support learners who might have more needs or needed more support during this time. So just wanted to add that to the equation.
No, that's it's very exciting to hear that, and I'm sure this is happening in places throughout the world. But it's another very powerful way in which I think Lucas in our session yesterday was talking about some of the more rigid boundaries becoming more permeable due to COVID. And one way in which that's happened in Australia, I think, is that there have been some quite powerful links made between schools and teacher education institutions through pre-service teachers working in the same way you're talking, Umesh, with their mentor teachers. So quite positive. I think probably time for another question from our audience.
Sure thing, Graham. We've got a question from Vika, and it's a bit specific. Well, they're mentioning it specifically about Indonesia. Mm-hmm. But what do you think can be done by the individual or an organisation, especially when inclusive education is something taboo to talk about in the community? And they're raising this because it is a cultural issue in Indonesia.
Yes, that's an interesting question. Well, it goes to some of the issues that Toon was talking about, it seems to me, where forgive me if I'm misreading you, Toon, but there was a sense in which COVID made it less taboo, or tried to open up the taboo and talking about disability and those parts of the community that are particularly vulnerable. Maybe you might be a good person to begin to speak to that question, even if it's from your perspective. The question, just to repeat, is what do you think can be done by an individual or an organization when inclusive education is something taboo, something shouldn't be talked about in the community?
Okay, so it's hard to say, but for the individual and for the organization, the society, they have a different perspective for inclusive education. But from my own perspective, there must be a kind of collaboration among the many parties of the society to to support inclusive education, because the parents only cannot do much to have children with disabilities, and the parents need many support from the government and the society. And in Vietnam we have all kinds of unions to support people with disabilities. We have like women's union and farmers union, and then the Red Cross, and then so inclusive education is something that requires the effort from everyone in the society.
Individuals can be powerful, but organizations, especially such as you mentioned, can be extremely powerful in changing attitudes in society. Does anybody else want to talk to that question?
I think as well, just to build on what Tuan says, in terms of advocacy, I think in a country where disability might be regarded as taboo and not talked about, and maybe even sidelined in mainstream discussion, it's probably those people, like I'm sure the person who asked the question is an advocate and has to therefore, become someone who champions that cause, because all of us on this panel as well are coming from a social justice perspective, and we believe that everyone, all students, regardless of ability in a classroom, deserve an equal shot at education, and it's their personal best within that space. So if that individual can champion that and become an advocate for inclusive education, even in those spaces, I think they will shift mindsets. They will discover that eventually, with enough perseverance and determination in that space, that they would probably shift the mindset of those other individuals who probably need to change.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Pearl. Yes, Umesh?
I'm sorry, I'm speaking too much, but I think this is a topic which is quite close to my heart, so I have to talk about it, and then I'll shut down. So one of the biggest problems, this is not only true in Indonesia, it's true in a large number of countries around the world. Attitudes are quite deep-rooted. People believe in something, it's very, very hard to change. They are not going to change easily. I can tell you it takes time. But with that, to change those things, one important thing that we need to do is we need to start thinking about how do those attitudes are formed. And I think who is most responsible? Actually, the people who are most responsible to change those attitudes are teacher educators. So during our teacher education programs, we need to start talking about why do teachers have, or our community has negative attitudes, and who are responsible to change those things. So if we do not start doing in our teacher education programs, why teachers have those attitudes or why community has it, we will not be able to change it. And it takes time, as I talked about. So if you think about, if you want to change something, one of the most important things that we cover in our teacher education program during inclusion is we teach that all learners are different. That's one of the most important things people need to believe. It's not that some students are disabled and others are not. Actually, it's the teaching disability. It's teachers do not learn how to teach all kids really well. Once they learn it, we are empowering teachers to get rid of those attitudes that they have in their head. And I think they also become much better teachers. So I use an example. Inclusion is an opportunity for teachers. So think about, if you're a driver, you always drove on easy roads in a village, you will be able to drive. The moment you go on a city road, and even in Indonesia, in Jakarta, where there's a lot of traffic, you'll find it so hard to drive. So what you do is if you learn to drive on those difficult roads, you become a better driver. So inclusion is the same thing. When teachers start believing that inclusion is an opportunity, it makes them a much better teacher. So that's where I realized it takes time, but the journey needs to start in teacher education or school leadership preparation. They need to learn it's an opportunity. They need to learn everyone is different. It's not that some students are different from the other one. And the moment the day you learn to address diversity in your classroom, you become better teacher, better leader, better person. And it has benefit for the society in the long run. That's it. I will not speak now.
Thank you, Umesh. Although there's been a strong call from the audience not to shut down Umesh. You'll be pleased to hear. Don't shut down Umesh, they said.
Graham, I just want to add something, like a lesson from Vietnam. In Vietnam, people with disabilities and who have some, successful stories are often, brought, to the limelight. They can appear in talk shows on television, and their successful stories broadcast and just to encourage other people with disabilities to do the same things as they have done, to become more successful in life. That's what we often do in Vietnam.
That's great to hear too. I should say, I think all of the presenters and panelists here on the screen, Vika, feel that you are indeed an advocate in your community, in your country, and we wish you all the best, because we're sure that you have the power to make the difference, as well as larger organizations, but all power to you and good luck to you. I think we've probably got time for one more question. Sesh, if you would like to share that question with us, please.
Yeah, so a great question here from Tran, and there's been a lot of discussions about this, particularly during online learning, about students with certain types of social anxiety that might find online study to be more favorable than face-to-face study, particularly after long periods of online study. So how should we actually prepare students for schools moving back to face-to-face learning?
Okay, yes, very good question indeed from Tran. Thank you for that. So how, for those students for whom COVID was a time of relief, perhaps they felt in a slightly more comfortable space to engage, and now they're being asked to come back into an environment where their levels of anxiety are probably elevated. I suppose the first question is whether we should be forcing them to come back into that space. And I'm sure there are arguments on both sides, but what might we do to help that transition back into a space where that sort of social contact with peers in an institution is very difficult for those people to contemplate? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, Graham. Yeah, I believe that the transition should be very smooth, very subtle, where the learning of online should be continue at some point of the time, so the students are not shocked with immediate face-to-face learning that should be happening in school. Hopefully through some social activities, slowly working with friends, working with peers, group work, will hopefully help to reduce the social anxiety that they're experiencing, because they've been so alienated with learning at home in the confined space. So I think it's important the transition to take into account other social factors, the peers, the teachers, and the environment in school itself.
Yes, thank you. So that's a strong recommendation for maintaining some of that online digital dimension of engaging with students and the diversity of students, and slow, smooth transition. Anybody else some suggestions about that?
I think that there should be the slow transition, and I think some schools have actually responded well in that they've allowed students some kind of autonomy when it comes to making decisions, especially the secondary school sector. So, we have digital delivery days in some schools, which might ease social anxiety for some students. And it's one of the lessons that we've learned from COVID, that we shouldn't be too rigid in the way that we do school, that there should be some form of digital delivery on a certain day of the week, perhaps on a curriculum day or something like that. That would be workable.
Absolutely. Thank you. Jenny, do you have a thought about that, a recommendation?
Well, we're not moving back yet to the classroom. It's, I think, going to take a while for the country to move back. There's certainly a more difficult atmosphere in the health sector before we allow our kids to go back and our teachers to go back to the classroom. But I think I would support the slow transition and that semblance of that autonomy for the students to choose what would work for them, and again for the teachers, what will work for them and what won't work for them, because certainly there are stories of teachers who are thriving better despite the challenges because they're closer to their kids, closer to their families, and they can still do the job while being at home. So I think it's a balance between how the students are going to be transitioned back to the classroom and how our teachers can support that transition. And then we don't forget the equation of the carers, the home carers, and how they can be supported. Slow transition also, that their kids are going back to the classroom.
Thank you, Jenny. And I thought it might be a nice way. We've got to wrap up any moment soon, but another of our audience members wanted to congratulate all of you, the presenters and panelists, for highlighting similar issues and alterations, but showing how they are being enacted in slightly different ways in different education environments. And this person was suggesting these discussions need to be continued on a research paradigm, which might be an invitation for those of us on this symposium tonight to be able to get together and see what we can do. So look, I'm really sorry to say that we need to wrap up that discussion. It's been a wonderfully rich and wide-ranging and passionate discussion.